Okay, there's a story about a father who became disturbed about the length of time his 6-year-old was taking to get home from school. And the father decided he would make the trip to discover for himself how long it should take the boy to get home. And the father settled for 20 minutes, but his son still took an hour. Finally, the father decided to make the trip with his son. After the trip, the father says, "The 20 minutes I thought reasonable was right, but I failed to consider such important things as a side trip to track down a trail of ants, or an educational stop to watch a man fix a flat, or the time it took to swing around a half dozen telephone poles, or how much time it took for a boy to get acquainted with two stray dogs and a brown cat." In short, the father said, "I had forgotten what it was like to be 6 years old." Remember when you were 6 years old? Think back to a place you called home. You can't go home again. Is that right? And if you could, and if you did, what would it be like? Home. Those four-letter words flood some minds with warm thoughts of laughter and family dinners, Walter Cronkite, lava lamps, homemade dinners by the greatest cook on the planet Earth in simpler times. Home for some brings some harsh memories, fear, and a feeling that there is somewhere between hopelessness and regret. There was a time in the life of Yeshua when he went home to Nazareth, the city of his upbringing. In Luke's Gospel, in chapter 4, verses 14 to 30, we learn that even for Yeshua Messiah, going home can sometimes be difficult. Yeshua returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and the news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. Luke chapter 4, verse 14. Yeshua returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee, and there went out a fame of him through all the regions round about. And he taught in their synagogues, being glorified of all. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of Yahweh is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, and set at liberty them that are bruised." In verse 19, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And he closed the book, and he gave it again to the minister, and he sat down, and the eyes of all them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say unto them, "This day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears." And all bare him witness, and wondered at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" And he said unto them, "You will surely say unto me this proverb, Physician, heal thyself. Whatsoever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in thy country." And he said, "Truly I say unto you, no prophet is accepted in his own country. But I tell you the truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elias, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, when great famine was throughout all the land. But unto none of them was Elias sent, save unto Sapphira, a city of Sodom, unto a woman that was a widow. And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet. None of them was cleansed, saving Naaman the Syrian. And they in the synagogue, when they heard these things, were filled with wrath, and rose up and thrust him out of the city, and led him unto the brow of the hill where the city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. But he passing through the midst of them, and he went his way. You can go home and be popular. You can go home and be rejected. You can go home, but there will come a time when you have to leave. You know, you're going home to be popular. Yeshua returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. The news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogues. And he stood up and he read, just like we just had today. The scroll, the prophet Isaiah, he was handed to him, and he found it. In the Spirit of Yahweh is on me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for those prisoners. Freedom from what? Have you ever wondered? Perhaps sin? Recovery of sight for the blind. What blindness? Perhaps we don't see the word of Yahweh? To release the oppressed. To proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor. He rolls up the scroll, and he goes back and sits down, and every eye is on him. Why? Why? What's so special about what he just read? Why did they look upon him? During those times, people were controlled by the synagogue that have control of the synagogue, had a law saying you could not say Yahweh. And if you were caught saying Yahweh, you were to be put to death. The people in the synagogue were shocked that he went and stood in front of everyone and proclaimed Yahweh. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? It was this synagogue that Yeshua must have frequented in years that he and his parents lived in Nazareth. From what Luke had already told us about our Yeshua's discussion with the teachers in Jerusalem at the early age of 12, you find that in Luke 2, verse 41 to 51. We must be willing to consider the likelihood that Yeshua did the same kind of thing with the Jewish teachers in the synagogue at Nazareth. Yeshua would have been a very familiar face in that place. The question, is this Joseph's son? They very well reflect the growing sense of recognition of this one whom they had seen so much in the past. Yeshua went home. Familiar sights and faces greeted him. Yet this wasn't to be a typical homecoming. Yeshua's journey to his home church, where he begins to read the word of Yahweh. And as he reads, he states that what they are hearing has come. In effect, the very word of Yahweh was standing in front of them. They initially missed it. They turned to one another and with faces beaming recalled Yeshua in his formative years, when as a boy he would amaze the synagogue teachers and the Torah readers of his insight. And now he has returned. And isn't it nice to see him again? How wonderful to hear him read again. To see him again in the synagogue as was his custom every Sabbath, not Sunday. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? These words were refreshing. They pointed people to the hope of a Messiah who would come and liberate the Jewish people from the tyranny of the Romans. Yes, it would be wonderful to be part of a new political movement where we will be in charge. led by the promised one. They believed Yeshua was speaking of the coming Messiah, not of himself. Family and friends were often warm to a general challenge to follow Yahweh and to expect something from Yahweh in return. As long as it's projected, futuristic, out there somewhere, no problem. You can go home and be popular. As long as your faith in Yahweh is not directly presented to those from home, it's okay. And yours will be a welcome face. Am I talking to someone today who's like Yeshua? Went home with a newfound faith, and initially everyone was thrilled to see you. Memories of your childhood and early experiences became the topic of conversation. Remember when? It was as if you were boarded at H.G. Wells' time machine, and the years that had distanced you from home seemed to melt away, and everything was just right. More than you expected. Until you let them know what Yahweh and Yeshua had done in your life. You see, you can go home and be popular as long as your faith stays hidden, tucked away and quiet. A story about two ladies were sharing lunch together when one said to the other, "I don't know many Christians, but somehow I can't help regarding them as hypocrites." The other one says, "But your sister-in-law, she lives in the same house with you. Surely you must acknowledge that she is a devoted Christian." "That's just it," the lady said, with a laughing reply. "She has a very lovely disposition, and she devotes her life to missions and school, but she has never said a word to me about becoming a Christian. It's only make-believe with her about souls being in danger. You need not tell me. I know that she is fond of me. But if she believed that, all of that, don't you think she would have said something?" Too many believers live their life like the sister, saved yet selfish, holding inside the words of life. When Yeshua went home, he was popular at first. You can go home and be popular until you step out of your comfort zone and declare your love for Yahweh. When you do, don't be surprised when you go home and be rejected. Yeshua said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' Do here in your hometown what we have heard you did at Capernaum." And he says, "I tell you the truth. No prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut up for 3.5 years and there were a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet. Yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman, the Syrian." And all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They didn't want to hear it. Elijah was one of the greatest Old Testament prophets. During a terrible famine, he stayed at a home of a widow who lived in Canaanite territory, just north of present-day Israel, near the city of Sidon. The prophet told her to bake him a cake, and she said that was her last bit of flour and olive oil, and the next day she and her son would begin dying of starvation. Elijah said, "Don't worry, the jar of meal that they had would not be empty, nor will the jug of oil fail for many days till the rains come." If you turn to 1 Kings chapter 17, starting in verse 8, this will be there's the story. 1 Kings 17, verse 8, and the word of Yahweh came unto him, saying, Arise, get thee to Zarephath, which belongeth to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, the widow woman was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in a vessel, that I may drink. And as she was going to fetch it, he called to her and said, Bring me, I pray thee, a morsel of bread in thy hand. And she said, As Yahweh thy Elohim lives, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse. And behold, I am gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said unto her, Fear not, go and do as thou hast said, but make me thereof a little cake first, and bring it unto me, and after make for thee and for thy son. For thus says Yahweh Elohim of Israel, the barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that Yahweh sendeth rain upon the earth. And she went and did according to the saying of Elijah, and she and he and her house did eat many days. And the barrel of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of Yahweh which he spoke by Elijah. Elijah was succeeded by his servant Elisha. And while he prophesied in Israel, the commander-in-chief of the Syrian army arrived demanding to be cured of his leprosy. The 5-star general was not only a foreigner, but a Syrian, were Israel's ruthless enemy, as they still are today. Elisha sent him to wash 7 times in the Jordan. And when the general came out of the water, his leprosy was not only healed, but his skin was restored like the flesh of a young boy. Find this in 2 Kings 5, verse 14. Then went he down and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of Elohim, and his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. The 2 stories are very familiar, but Yeshua pointed out a very unexpected conclusion. There were a huge number of widows in Israel at the time of Elijah, but not one of them experienced a miracle. There were hundreds of lepers wandering around the countryside, and not one of them was healed. The point was obvious. The local people all thought, oh, this is Elijah. He was raised among us. What can he do? And we know this Elijah. He was just Elijah's personal servant. We wouldn't expect a miracle from him. You're just a brother or sister. What do you know? You're just a co-worker. What do you know? I know what you were like when you were younger. We wouldn't expect a miracle from him. Scornful unbelievers always prevent Yahweh's healing power. Yeshua's hearers were furious at the suggestion that Yahweh cared about foreigners from among the despised Canaanites and the hated Syrian armies of Israel. So we read, all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. Yeshua compared the real unbelief they had in their hearts with the unbelief in the hearts of their ancestors thousands of years earlier. Yeshua tells them, just like Yahweh the Father blessed non-Jews in their ancestors' day, Yahweh would bless non-Jews through the ministry and life of Yeshua. They stopped liking Yeshua at the point they started hating Yeshua. They didn't like what he was saying. They don't like what he's saying today. That Bible isn't real, it's a fake book. They don't want you to see what's in the Bible because it contradicts how they live their life. They don't like what Yahweh has to say. At one level, it might be easy to understand the level of their anger. They had been living under the hard Roman rule for hundreds of years. The area where they lived had experienced the hardness of rule. History tells us not far from Nazareth was a larger city called Sepphoris. Around the time Yeshua was born, some Jews in the area tried to revolt against the Roman rule. The Romans simply sent an army, killed the rebels, and destroyed much of the town. Now Yeshua is telling them that they will not get freedom, but that pagan army officers like Naaman, the Syrian, and the ones who destroyed their area will get blessed from the Messiah. I tell you the truth, he continues, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut up for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land, yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in the region of Sidon. There were many in Israel with leprosy. In the time of Elisha the prophet, yet none of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. All the people in America are furious when they hear this, what their life is doing is all sinful. There are times we will hear from Yahweh things we would rather not hear. A word of correction or rebuke that reveals our own faults and problems or prejudices. We need to ask ourselves this direct question. Is there anybody in my heart that I don't want Yahweh to bless? In this story, the people of Nazareth exhibited a mindset that Yeshua ran into his whole ministry. He kept getting into conflicts with people who didn't want Yahweh to bless non-Jews. He's our God, not yours. The unfaithful sinner, the drunks, the children, the foreigners, the outcasts. Each and every time Yeshua found a way to bless those others did not want blessed. When you adopt a like outlook about people and the potential of each and every person, don't be surprised if others distance themselves from you and make your homecoming difficult. All of us here can truly say that we have never locked eyes onto someone that did not matter to Yahweh. Everyone matters. You can tell a lot about a person by the way they treat those who can do nothing for them. You can go home and be popular. You can go home and be rejected. And you can go home, but there will come a time to leave. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him down the cliff. But he walked right through them and went his own way. They had heard enough. It's one thing to leave a town and become successful, quite another to return and speak on behalf of Yahweh and challenge the motives of those who believe they're adhering to the will of Yahweh. What do you do when those familiar faces and places no longer want to hear what you have to say? I believe that love and kindness should always be a part of our personality and interaction with people. However, when those in your life try to get you to compromise your faith and adopt a less expressive relationship with the Lord, and we have seen that today, if If you disagree with what's going on out here, keep your mouth shut. But if you let them try to get you to compromise your faith and adopt a less expressive relationship with the Lord, then there may come a time to say goodbye until a more opportune time. You can be sure Yahweh will protect you. Even though you may be on the receiving end of threats, we learn that Yahweh is in ultimate control of our life. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, they wanted to drive him out of town and take him to the top of the hill and throw him down. He just walked his way through. You can go home and be popular. You can go home and be rejected. You can go home, but there will come a time to leave. Place devotion to Yahweh above the acceptance of people. Realize that sometimes you're serving the Lord and you will make others mad. Be reminded that Yahweh's protection is always provided.